Almost a year to the day since we did that big debunking of the New York Times Screams Without Words, Jeffrey Gettleman article that purported to uh, put meat on the bones of Israel's claims of October 7th rapes. And uh, it turned out to be a complete journalistic fraud, as we showed at the Electronic Intifada, and people can go back and find that video on our channel. Uh, of course, we have talked about that several times, the rape hoax. It won't go away. And there's a couple of big updates on it that I wanted to get into. So, of course, I doubt many people don't know what I'm talking about, but for those who don't, one of Israel's main propaganda claims is that on October 7th, there was an organized campaign of mass rapes by Hamas fighters of Israeli women and even of Israeli men. Um, and as we've been saying consistently and showing through our investigations, in fact, to this day, there is not one single identified victim, living or dead, of a rape on October 7th, 2023. Not one. That remains the case to this day. But you don't have to believe the Electronic Intifada if you don't want to, because we have always pointed to our sources. And now there is a new one that we reported on this week that I wrote about. And this is an interview that appeared in the Israeli newspaper, or in the magazine of the Israeli newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, which is one of the main newspapers in Gaza. And that's it. It's an interview with a senior Israeli prosecutor called Moran Gez, and she was in charge of the southern district of Israel. There was even a picture of her on the Ynet headline, but I don't know if we have it. But that's just to give a sense of it, where she talks about the effort to quote unquote bring to justice the hundreds or maybe even unknown number of Palestinians captured by Israel on October 7th and since October 7th. And she reveals in this interview that to this day, it was published on January 1st this year, there are still zero. There we go. Yeah, I just think, the way I wanted people to see that, because like she's this intrepid prosecutor marching towards justice, and the way they framed it, I thought people should see that. Thank you for pulling that up, Tamara. So Moran Gez is her name, and what she reveals in this interview is that to this day there are still zero complainants in alleged cases of rape committed by Palestinians on October 7th. In other words, they haven't found a single victim. And as I mentioned, she was in charge of, bringing about these prosecutions, none of which have actually happened yet. And she said a lot of horrifying things in this interview, which of course we had translated to English. She calls for mass executions of all the Palestinians detained on October 7th, even without any substantial evidence against them of any particular crime. She makes that clear. She says, anyone who entered Israel from Gaza on 7 October to kill or to loot, it doesn't matter, should be included in the indictment, and as far as I'm concerned, receive the death penalty. And Tamara, you could show item 2, which is our article, which contains the quotes that I'm reading so that people can find it. And there's the headline of our article on the Electronic Intifada published on January 6th. Israel still can't find any 7 October rape victims, prosecutor admits. And she told her colleagues, the other prosecutors, why she thinks everyone they captured should be executed. And she says, because of those who didn't murder but looted, burned, stole, picked avocados, as some claim, because of this mess, the Israeli army forces were unable to arrive in time. You came to the door with a drill and opened it to loot. Then a terrorist came in and murdered civilians there. So, in other words, if you just picked avocados on October 7th, avocados planted on land stolen from Palestinians in 1948, for example, the Abu Sitta family, whose village of Ma'in Abu Sitta is right where some of those kibbutzes are. Of course, we spoke with Dunya Abu Sitta earlier. If you picked an avocado, you get the death penalty, according to her. And she also admits, and this is not just about the sexual crimes, but in general, that Israel has little evidence against any specific individual. Um, she says, or as 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 puts it, quote, the biggest difficulty is evidentiary, Gez explains, using evidence to link a specific crime to a specific defendant when dealing with dozens of crime scenes where hundreds of suspects were caught and thousands of offenses were committed is almost impossible. And so what she says is we have to change the rules basically so that you don't need evidence. And she explicitly advocates bringing back military courts for Palestinians from Gaza. And people may know that Palestinians in the West Bank are brought before military courts where the conviction rate is 100% and they are presumed guilty. But Israel actually abolished the military courts for Palestinians from Gaza after the so-called disengagement. So in theory, when a Palestinian enters Israel and commits what Israel considers to be a crime, they're actually supposed to be tried in an Israeli civilian court. Now, there are many stories of why, they don't get fair trials either, but she wants to explicitly bring back military courts to do away with the need for any sort of due process or evidence.
She's
But really,
admitting the role of the military courts. Yeah,
yeah,
of course.
basically. I mean, it's too difficult to find evidence against a particular individual. So why bother? Just go to the military court and proceed to execution. Now, I should make clear that she does say that she doesn't think it's likely that they're going to use the death penalty, but she really wants that and she advocates for it. And that's just a sign of the quality of so-called justice Palestinians can get. But I think one of the key revelations here is her admission that basically Israel has zero evidence of October 7 rapes, totally destroying its biggest, most poisonous propaganda narrative that is still being used to justify the ongoing genocide. And in the interview with 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 Ynet, Gez confirms that 15 months later, after the alleged events, Israel still has not identified a single victim in which a prosecution can be brought against an alleged perpetrator. Quote, unfortunately, it will be very difficult to prove these crimes, she said. In the end, we have no complainants, Gez admitted, and she notes the vast gap between public perceptions and the reality. Quote, comparing what was presented in the media to what will come together in the end, it will be altogether different, Gez said. And she offers the usual spin that this is either because the victims were murdered or because women who were raped are not ready to reveal it. But this excuse really does not wash for why there have been no victims, because there is zero forensic evidence. Israel acknowledges that. Zero video or photo evidence. Credible eyewitness evidence is totally absent. And that's remarkable, especially when these rapes were supposedly, we're not talking about one or two isolated incidents. They're claiming this was an organized mass campaign of rape
Yeah.
that was happening all over the place on October 7th. And as far as living victims are confirmed, she says that they don't have any complainants, and she said we really tried to find some. She says, "quote We turned to women's rights groups and we asked for cooperation. They told us that they were simply not approached. In other words, no victims came forward." Sorry, Nori, you wanted to say something,
No, no,
right?
no. I think I was just reacting. Yeah, I mean this, and Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah.
It's fine.
And so this is the prosecutor in charge of prosecuting these cases, or she just left that position. So
Yeah.
until very recently, she was in charge of them. So she's saying we tried, we searched everywhere. No, the rape crisis centers, no victims. And this corroborates, people will recall, speaking of the Jeffrey Gettleman article that we debunked a year ago, this corroborates the experience of the New York Times, which extensively canvassed Israeli hospitals, rape crisis centers, sexual assault hotlines, and other specialized facilities, and they could not find a single victim of a 7 October sexual attack. Remember, Anat Schwartz, one of the journalists on that byline with Jeffrey Gettleman, gave an interview to Israel's Channel 12 last year, and she said that she was the one who actually did the canvassing for the New York Times, going to every hospital and rape crisis center in Israel. And she said, quote, no one had met a victim of a sexual assault. But of course, instead of taking the hint, that there is no story here, the New York Times said, well, there are no victims, let's make some up.
Yeah.
Good old New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. And of course, that journalistic fraud fell apart and engulfed the New York Times in scandal. But now we have it from an Israeli prosecutor: no victims, no evidence. The word she actually uses in the interview is, we have to lower expectations about
Right.
this.
Yeah.
So what
And
happens? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
this is what we've been saying all along, that there's not only no evidence of rape on the 7th of October, but there's no allegations. There's no named victim. There's no unnamed victim. There's no, like, you could say, okay, if a rape had taken place, there would be a case for having an anonymous victim speak in the media. That hasn't happened either. There's nothing. There's nothing here. There's no substantive allegation except for the wide, rape must have happened on the 7th of October because Palestinians are just so evil. It's the evidence is literally the imagination of the colonizer.
And
100%.
it's a lie that's not just been used to generate, sympathy for Israelis, the only and eternal victims, in order to gin up, support for the genocide that's now in its 16th month. But it's been used by U.S. politicians very recently, all the time. I can't even. I mean, didn't Kamala Harris in one of her final speeches before she lost in the election in November, she was still talking about not just the mass rapes of Israeli women, but also, I believe, the 40 beheaded babies lie. I mean, it just, all of these completely fabricated, easily debunked hoaxes that have just, what did Goebbels say? If you repeat a lie enough times, it becomes the truth. That's essentially what we keep seeing.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Shameful.
Tamara, I meant to ask you to put up number 3, which just again is a reminder for people of our debunking a year ago. See there, 9 January 2024, a year ago today, that this article was written, and that we debunked this massive hoax that the New York Times put out. And the headline, for those who are listening: watch, New York Times investigation of mass rape by Hamas falls apart. But that's not the only update. What I just gave you, the interview with the Israeli prosecutor on this mass rapes hoax story. Another story appeared in Haaretz yesterday. And Tamara, I am not sure if I actually gave you that headline to show. I certainly meant to, but the headline is, in the Haaretz story, Israel blocks UN probe into Hamas sexual crimes from October 7th. to avoid inquiry into Hamas abuse. And I will.
There we go.
Oh, okay. Thank you. You're faster than me, Tamara. Thank you. And I apologize for that. But yeah, this story that is in Haaretz says that, let me find my spot in my notes here. Israel is blocking the United Nations from investigating sexual crimes committed by Hamas during its October 7th attack, fearing it would require granting access to probe allegations of sexual violence against Palestinians in Israeli detention. A thorough investigation could have led to Hamas being added to the UN's blacklist of entities suspected of sexual violence in conflicts, according to Haaretz. Now, this Haaretz story refers to plans for Pramila Patten, the UN Secretary General's representative on sexual violence and armed conflict, to come back to Israel and conduct a probe into alleged sexual violence. You'll recall that Patten published a rather shoddy report last year that laundered many of Israel's claims. But despite that, Patten did debunk many of Israel's lies in her report. And Tamara, if you could put up item number 4, you can see the Electronic Intifada story by me and Asa last March, discussing in detail the Pramila Patten report. And in that report, Patten and her team had to concede that they were unable to locate a single victim and did not speak to any alleged survivors of sexual violence or rape from October 7th. And they said that they reviewed thousands of photos and videos provided by Israel and from open sources and could not find any tangible evidence of rape in them, and that they had not been shown any forensic evidence whatsoever. But now Israeli government-aligned women's groups who have been pushing the October 7th mass rapes hoax want Pramila Patten to come back and do a more detailed investigation, according to Haaretz, which reports, quote, Patten's office warned that Israel's resistance to UN investigations into alleged crimes attributed to it could backfire, according to representatives of the Israel's Women's Network who met with Patten's team late last month. They further said they were told that Israel's approach could result in its inclusion on the UN's blacklist of entities responsible for sexual violence in conflicts, while Hamas could remain off the list.
Remember, there was that whole series of protests by Israelis, banging on a prison door, protesting for the right to rape Palestinian detainees.
Right.
It was, and one of the alleged rapists of Palestinians in I believe it was Sideh Tayman, was he was doing these media interviews with a mask on, and then in one Israeli media interview he revealed himself, and instead of being publicly shamed or prosecuted for the sexual abuse of Palestinians, he became an Israeli media darling. He went on a tour of Israeli stations, boasting, bragging about how he had committed rape.
The right to rape protest. So,
yes.
So they're saying that, if Israel doesn't let the UN investigate, then then Israel will end up on the list, and Hamas will get away scot-free with its alleged rapes because Israel isn't allowing access to victims, isn't allowing, that's their line.
Right.
But I that's very disingenuous, because I do not believe the basic premise of this Haaretz article that Israel is blocking the UN probe just because it doesn't want its own crimes investigated, exactly the ones you just mentioned, Nora. That may be one motivation. I think the real reason, which is of course not acknowledged by Haaretz, but was acknowledged by the prosecutor Moran Gez, is that there is no evidence of
Right.
Hamas carrying out any rapes on October 7th. So the worst case scenario for Israel would be to allow in a UN team to conduct an independent investigation and end up publishing a report saying, as previous UN reports have said, that we couldn't find any evidence for this massive claim. We couldn't find any victims. There was no forensic evidence. We looked at the same thousands of photos and videos that Pramila Paten's team looked at, and we still couldn't find any rapes. The eyewitnesses' stories all fell apart and so on. That would be the worst case. So the best way for Israel to keep the mass rapes hoax alive is by blocking an investigation and keeping a cloud of uncertainty around the whole thing. You know, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen, is better than it definitely didn't happen.
Right.
Because we had an independent investigation, the UN couldn't find anything.
Yeah, so, I'm generally unsurprised, generally speaking, that Israel wants to block another investigation by the UN into the events of October 7th because they don't want any risk of the truth accidentally coming out, right? Like even with people like Pramila Patten doing their best to and her team in that report doing best to kind of whitewash and to kind of launder Israel's false narrative about the alleged sexual abuse that took place on October 7th. She still accidentally, as you mentioned, she still accidentally found all the, almost despite the intentions, found all this contrary evidence to it, and found nothing substantial, like you said. And other UN reports have done similar things. So when there was the UN report, as I wrote about in one of my articles in October, there was this UN report into. It was supposed to be a kind of balancing report, the UN report into the Palestinian military offensive on October 7th, the Al-Aqsa Flood operation. And the whole point of it was that it was supposed to document alleged war crimes by Hamas. But within that report, as I wrote about, the UN team ended up finding all this evidence that actually a lot of those people, a lot of the Israelis killed on October 7th, were killed by Israel itself, by under the Hannibal Directive, and they were kind of forced to write about the Hannibal Directive because that was the reality that they found when they started investigating it. They didn't get very far, they didn't get as far as we've done by a long shot. But nonetheless, that report, which the whole point of it was supposed to show how evil Hamas is, ended up showing, well, actually, Israel killed a lot of these people. So, I'm not surprised they want to block this as well.
Yeah, and this is an important thing about these UN reports that I think I want to take a minute to explain, because the UN is a political body. I mean, politics is there at every level. We heard Chris Gunnis say that earlier in a different context, talking about UNRWA. And so there is this massive pressure campaign on the UN by Israel and its lobby, and mobilizing these fake Israeli feminist groups to put pressure on the UN to say, oh, you refuse to believe Israeli women just because they're Jewish. The UN is biased because it refuses to recognize Israeli women as victims of these rapes. So what happens is Pramila Patten, who's the political appointee of the Secretary General, the representative of for sexual violence in conflict, goes to Israel, writes this report. It's not a full investigation. It's just she goes there and she looks at things. And she comes back and she bends over backwards. I mean, the spin that's put on the report tries its best to give as much credence to the Israeli allegations as possible. And that's in the headline of the report, that's in the executive summary, that's in the press release that goes out. And then that's what makes the headlines in the mainstream media, because the mainstream media are not sitting down and reading the 300-page report. They are going off the press release, which is putting in this spin. We are the ones who are reading the 300-page report and finding, on page 85 or 137 or whatever it is, the paragraph that says we couldn't verify a single allegation of rape, the paragraph that says we looked at thousands of photos and videos, we couldn't see any tangible signs of rape, we couldn't find any forensic evidence, and so on and so forth. So that's why these UN reports often, the real conclusion, the real meat of it is the opposite of the headline that's in the press release or the executive summary. So I just, that, and we're going to see more such reports coming out for sure. And it's important to keep that in mind. You can't go off the press coverage of these reports. You have to actually read them. And we do that for you here at the Electronic Intifada with our highlighters, with our expo markers, to remember our friend 𝐓𝐡𝐞. That's our weapon, our expo markers, going through these reports with the fine-tooth comb. But I want to just say, if I can, just take a minute to point out that, Nora, of course, you brought up the horrific, huge amount of evidence of Israeli sexual violence of Palestinians, sexual torture of Palestinians, and in the past 15 months, in contrast to Israel. Because remember, one of the excuses that Israel gives is, oh, well, the victims of October 7th rapes are either dead, well, then where's the forensic evidence? Where's the photographic evidence? There's none. But they say, oh, they're dead, or they're just too traumatized and too ashamed to come forward. Well, presumably Palestinians would be no less traumatized and ashamed to come forward with accounts of sexual torture and rape and violence and victimization. And yet many Palestinians have come forward with detailed accounts either of being victimized firsthand or eyewitnessing sexual violence and torture by Israel. And those reports keep coming out. And just very recently, the Euramed for Human Rights, which is one of the groups that has been doing incredible work collecting and documenting and corroborating these testimonies, put out and I think we can just show the headline, that's item 5, Tamara, of sexual assaults by Israeli forces in the context of the attack, the ransacking of Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza, just in the last few weeks, of course, the hospital from which Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya was abducted. And I just want to share a few sentences of that. And it is, I have to warn people, I'm going to read disturbing accounts from some of the people there, but just to give a sense of what Israel is doing now, continuously ongoing, of the accounts where Euramed documents that at Kamal Adwan Hospital, Israel detained dozens of women and girls, subjecting them to severe abuse amounting to sexual harassment alongside degrading treatment that violated their human dignity. This included beating them and forcing them to remove their hijabs and clothing. One of the women expelled from the area told the Euramed team, quote, a soldier forced a nurse to take off her trousers, then placed his hand on her. When she tried to resist, he struck her hard across the face, causing her nose to bleed. Another woman reported that a soldier told a woman in their group, take it off or we'll force it off you. In another incident, a woman refused to remove her headscarf, prompting a soldier to tear her clothes, exposing her chest. One victim recounted being dragged by a soldier who forced her to press against him, saying, take it off now, while hurling obscene remarks at her. Similarly, a hospital staff member told Euramed, quote, the soldiers ordered us to remove our hijabs, but we refused. They then turned to the girls under 20 years old and demanded they remove their hijabs, but they also refused. The soldiers decided to punish us by taking 2 women at a time and forcing them to lift their clothes and lower their trousers under threats and coercion. And that's just a part of the testimonies coming out of Kamal Adwan. And I'd ask people, how much have you heard about this on the BBC or the CBC or in the New York Times or the Washington Post that have been screaming nonstop for 15 years about the imaginary invented October 7 rapes?
Exactly. Thanks, Ali. And you know, it's not easy to pour through these reports and to read these testimonies and to see video evidence of the sexual violence and torture that Palestinians are being forced to endure. But you know, this is incredibly important to keep this documented and to keep, you know, to be able to put a wrench into this, you know, into this system of just absolute lies meant to justify a Holocaust in the most depraved way. So thanks for keeping on this story.